Hello, my name is Bernadette Eugene-Charlery. In fact, my official name has an M at the beginning of it, and that's a story for another day, but I might just give you a little insight into it. I was born in a very small island in the Caribbean called St. Lucia. I lived there till I was 8 years old, actually. I am one of 10 children. I have 4 brothers and 5 sisters. And I was going to say it's a blessing, but it's not always a blessing. Sometimes coming from a very large family is not a blessing. But, I am one of 10 children. I am married. I have 3 biological sons and 1 adopted son, a blended son, who's my husband's son. In St. Lucia, my family is very, very large. We are Edgars, Eugenes, and more Sherrys. And I'm married into a family that's also very, very large, and they are Charles, Serrier, and Charlery. So, however I look at it, I've come from very, very large families. And as I previously said, I lived in St. Lucia till I was 8 years old, and all my life in St. Lucia, I've always known my name as Bernadette Eugene. I come to England at the age of 8 to join my parents. And when I was old enough to read and start looking at official documents, well, actually, I was old enough to read, but I didn't have access to official documents. I just started seeing this Mary in front of Bernadette, and I'm thinking, well, who's this? Never ever knew that my first name actually was Mary. So I'm Mary Bernadette Eugene-Charlery. Never heard Mary before in my entire life. All the time I was in St. Lucia, I was never ever called Mary. To this day, I've never really embraced Mary as my name. But because it's on my official documents, obviously I recognize the M, but I am known as Bernadette. Now, I came to England, as I said, at the age of 8, and the transition was traumatic because all I'd ever known was my grandmother, who raised us, my aunts and uncles, who were a little bit older than me, not significantly older, but older. And I've come to this country where it was cold, to a woman, my biological mother, who I had seen fleetingly on a couple of occasions, and now living with her full time. So having to adjust, not just to a different climate. And I came in December of 1967, so it was freezing. The adjustment, I think, now reflecting on the adjustment, was a lot more problematic than I realized at the time. And I think it took me some time to really appreciate how significant those changes were in my life. From leaving the only mother that I really knew, my grandmother, the only caregivers that I really knew, my aunts and uncles, who assumed care in my mother and father's absence, to come into a country where my brother and I came together, and I left my other siblings in the Caribbean. Actually, when I came over to England in 1967, the year after I arrived, my younger sisters were born. So the siblings that I grew up with, I was now separated from them. And I do a lot of work now around trauma and the impact of trauma on functioning. And I now realize many of my responses at that time were trauma-led. Obviously didn't have the cognitive maturity to understand that, didn't have the language to articulate it. And I was with a mother who was working very, very hard to give us a life that she believed would make us into the type of human being she wanted us to be. And because she was working so hard, she didn't really have the time to sit down and really talk about my innermost feelings and the significant issues of bereavement and loss and how it affected me. I came from an education system where my cousin Janet and I in the Caribbean, they are driven. Education is uppermost in families' expectations. And Janet and I, one year, there were always exams, and at the end of every year, they'd have these tests, and you were ranked according to where you placed in these tests. And one year I'd come first, and Janet would come second. The next year, Janet would come first, I'd come second. And I'll never forget, there were 2 years where I came second, and my grandmother hit the roof. She couldn't understand why I wasn't top of the class. And I came to a system in the UK where I joined a school where I now better understand that the aspirations for me were minimum. I wasn't expected to do well. I wasn't required to do well, and I wasn't pushed to do well, which is very, very different from my experience in the Caribbean. We were very, very disciplined. Children were very respectful. Teachers were revered in the Caribbean, not so in the UK when I arrived, and it was a totally different system. That said, I did do well at school because not doing well wasn't an option. And I remember at 16 saying to my careers teacher that I wanted to be a nursery nurse, and being given information on how to be recruited for the Tetanai sugar factory, the local factory that a lot of people in the area were employed by. And I didn't really understand the inherent racism in that discussion with that careers teacher, and the fact that they saw no other career opportunity for me than to go and work in a factory, despite the fact that I was quite a bright child. And I think that experience really, it disturbed me. And I think for the first time, I really understood injustice and was determined that not only was I not going to work in a sugar factory, I was going to be the professional that I believed I had the right to be and to choose to be. And so I did apply to be a nursery nurse. I did get onto the program, and there were just 2 Black women on that program. Another young woman called Angeline and myself. She dropped out at some point, and I don't know why. But once I finished that course, I then went on to work in a variety of settings as a nursery nurse. Initially in day nurseries, then nursery classes. I worked in a special care baby unit. I worked in postnatal wards. And it was the richness of experience that I'd always craved. And I think it introduced me to a hunger for progression, a hunger for professionalism, a hunger for aspirations. And I really wanted to develop. I was the eldest girl, and there is always an unspoken expectation that you pave the way for your younger siblings, especially your younger sisters. And so I was held up as somebody who needed to do right, achieve, so that my sisters were able to emulate what I had achieved. And in fact, my sisters are all exceptionally bright young women, and they all did very well at school. So although I was deemed the one who needed to pave the way, they've surpassed my educational achievements. And of that, I am exceptionally proud. The fact that my mother was able to, on her own in the end, care for us all and afford us a quality parenting that she did afford us is testimony to her resolve, her resilience, and her steadfastness in the face of adversity. And I think initially the challenges I experienced in school around discrimination, oppression, adversity, when I communicated those to my mother, she struggled to understand what that looked like. Because in the Caribbean, you didn't question teachers, and whatever teacher said was correct. So she struggled to understand why I would be reporting to her issues of negativity experienced from those teachers. Nevertheless, I think what those experiences did for me was to galvanize me into action. And I may be a little precipitous in saying this, but I think that was the beginning of my awakening. That was the beginning around understanding self. That was the beginning around truly walking in my truth and my purpose. Because I think once I qualified as a nursery nurse and worked for a number of years across the settings that I've already highlighted, I then decided I wanted to do something different. And so from nursery nursing, I became an education welfare officer in what was then the ILEA. And I was based in what was Division 4, which was Hackney. And I had my first real experience of court, and that was about taking parents of children who weren't regular school attenders to court, and not really understanding at that time the power that I walked in, and believing instead that I had more to do to empower parents, because I think there were many, what I now understand to be challenges, what we now call our social determinants, that adversely affect parenting, that I didn't quite understand at that point, or didn't take into account, or the system didn't take into account. So invariably, many of the families we were prosecuting had significant challenges that they were trying to navigate, that they weren't able to articulate. And as a consequence, they were being penalized. And I did that job for many, many years, not getting any real satisfaction in the end, actually, because I hated taking parents to court. I really hated it. But I was part of a system where that was a requirement. From being an education welfare officer, I retrained as a social worker. And boy, did that not open my eyes to social injustice. You understand the theory, but relating all that theory to practice was an eye-opener. Because what the course don't teach you is how you understand human beings and human behaviors, and how those behaviors will have a significant impact on your own functioning, because you can't help but be affected by what affects human beings that you're working with day in, day out. And as a social worker, I specialise in children and families. And I absolutely loved being a social worker. But I always felt as I progressed up the ranks, and I was blessed in that I did progress, and I progressed quite quickly. I remember feeling that my wings were clipped, because I always felt there was a lot more that I could do to support families differently. And because of my own experience of being parented by a single woman, a woman who was invited to come to England, the motherland where the streets were paved with gold, who came to England as a qualified teacher, whose qualification as a teacher was never ever acknowledged. And as a lone parent, my mother worked in that very same sugar factory that the careers teacher suggested for me. She worked in that factory almost all her life while she was here, providing for her children. She was a proud woman, and her work ethic was second to none. And that work ethic is part of my DNA. I have always worked, always striding to improve self, to improve my situation. And once obviously I had my children, I was married, to improve their lives and to be somebody who could model behaviors that they could emulate. And feeling that my wings were clipped, more often than not, even in my senior positions, I would take on board some of the challenges that parents are presented with and do direct pieces of work myself. Because there's something about supporting staff to go back to basics, supporting staff to understand trauma responses, supporting staff to think about how do you engage families so that your conversations and your interventions are meaningful. How do you engage families so that you truly see them and not just what a system has told you about them? How do you see families so that your communication with them enables you to be heard and for them to feel held? How do you converse with families so that you're working with and not working against? How do you communicate with families so that they feel empowered, they feel enabled, they feel heard? And I felt that there was a real disconnect between the way we worked with children and how the absence of working meaningfully with parents really was quite incongruent with the way that the system said we should be working with whole families. Because actually, I don't think we worked with whole families. We did the work with children, and we asked for parents' views and we made judgments about parents. But I don't think we worked with parents in the way that I think we could have done. And it has become my mission to work differently with families. And when I think about now, in this next chapter of my life, starting my own business called Freedom to Fly, I was very intentional about the title or the name of my business. I really wanted to give children, young people, other professionals the freedom to fly, but to fly with integrity, to fly with compassion, to fly with insight, to fly with kindness and sensitivity, knowing that in that flight you can make a real difference to families' lives and children's experiences. And so my company's Freedom to Fly, through that company, I hope to provide opportunities that are transformative, opportunities that are all trauma informed, neurodiverse sensitive. Because I know growing up, there was nobody within my network that adopted a trauma informed approach in supporting me. And I know that there, but for the grace of God, go I really, because growing up with my lone parent at that point was very hard. And when we talk about those social determinants that negatively impact, we were talking about poor housing. We were talking about diluted finances. We were talking about big families that needed to be fed. We were talking about a woman who worked hard and had little time to meet the emotional needs of her children in the way I know she would have wanted to meet them. We're talking about a woman who had a staunch belief system in Christianity and really believed that in all things give God praise, as I believe. In all things put God first. In all things lean on God. A woman who brought her children over from the Caribbean 2 by 2 until she had brought us all over on her own. I remember in the very early days sharing accommodation with one of my father's cousins. They lived upstairs, we lived downstairs. And on reflection, I'm looking at it now, it literally was 2 bedrooms downstairs and a small kitchen. Two bedrooms and a small kitchen downstairs. And 2 bedrooms and a small kitchen and bathroom upstairs. And we lived there for many years, many years. Until we were fortunate enough to be given a much larger property, a little distance from where we were, but not too far to make us have to change schools, etc. And so when I talk about new beginnings, there were so many new beginnings for me. You know, from my life, which was an idyllic life for me in St. Lucia. You know, we were grandchildren of a woman who was very well known in the district. She had a number of children herself, many of whom were professionals, they were teachers. Because she had children who were living abroad, she had, at the time that I was there, the only house in the district made of brick. And when I reflect on that, I now understand that people are like, oh, that's Miss Bessie's granddaughter, Miss Bessie's grandchildren, Miss Bessie's this, Miss Bessie's that. Because Miss Bessie had access to a lot more than her counterparts, because she had children abroad who were sending her money, sending her trunks, I think they were at the time, with clothing and all sorts of stuff. And so she had a much more comfortable life than many of her counterparts. And I remember because her children were abroad, my grandmother raised my cousins and I in this, what I now look back on was the tiniest little house, but in my child's eye, it was massive. And it was only when I came to England that I understood that many of the cousins who I grew up with believing to be my brothers and sisters were actually not my brothers and sisters. They were actually first cousins. But we were raised in such a way that there was no distinction between us. And so when barrels, trunks, whatever it was that came down from England, from whatever aunt, uncle, my parents, whoever, it was shared out amongst all the kids. So it was never, oh, your mum sent this and this is yours, or my uncle sent this for his children. It was never that. As far as my grandmother was concerned, it came into her house and it was shared equally between everyone. And so I never understood that we weren't brothers and sisters and that we were cousins. When I look back on my experience of being parented in the Caribbean, I can now see some of the differences that in my child's mind I didn't see. Because we left my cousins in St. Lucia because their parents didn't have the money to send for them at the same rate that my mother did. They did all eventually join us or come to the UK. They didn't join us, but they came to the UK. But they came later. And growing up, when we moved to the bigger property, when it was just a single family dwelling, those cousins, or some of those cousins, lived not too far away, about 2 or 3 roads away from us. And it was a beautiful time, because I remember the summer holidays, all holidays actually, those cousins would be at our house. And the bond that we shared growing up was still there. To this day, those bonds are still there. And it's so hard to explain to people, yes, she's my cousin or they're my cousins, but we were raised together. For those of you who were raised by grandparents in the Caribbean, you will be able to resonate with this. And the connection that you have, that at times, those connections are difficult to describe, but those connections are so, so important for your sense of self, your sense of security, just your sense of belonging. And having my 3 boys and my stepson, it's the most beautiful experience in my life until I had my grandchildren. Oh my goodness. Until I had my grandbabies. New beginnings. Leaving St. Lucia and all that I knew, all that I held dear. New beginning. Coming to the UK, coming on an aeroplane for the first time. Coming to a country that was freezing cold. I arrived on the 22nd of December. Joining a mother who I had no connection with. Going to a household where we were sharing amenities with another family, albeit cousins, but I didn't know those people. Going to a school where they had no real aspirations for me. They didn't expect me to do well. Having to fight in an area where there were very, very few black people in the East End of London. And as a young girl growing up, having to fight white boys, but then understanding that I had my siblings, especially my brothers, and those boys knew if you fought one sister, you had to fight us all. And as a consequence, we gained respect because we were such a large family. But also because in the East End at the time, You had no choice but to get along with people. But that getting along came at a cost. We were exposed to so much racism. That my mother was a real advocate for non-violent responses. How she had children like us, we'll never know, because my mother was the most passive individual you ever meet in your life. And her children are the total opposite. Total opposite. Thank you, God. Because we can advocate for self and we can advocate for others. We can be assertive. We are bright. We're intelligent. We are strong. New beginnings. I've been told that I couldn't be a nursery nurse because I didn't quite fit the image of nursery nursing at that time, so many years ago. Being told that the only aspiration for me was to work in a sugar factory. New beginnings, joining college, and again having to face the racism on that course. Being failed the first time I took that exam. Thankfully, during the course of the 2-year program, I had been complaining about discrimination, and I kept copies of everything that I've written. I kept a journal, I kept a folder of work, and I don't know what made me do it, and maybe God was even then protecting me. And because I'd been sponsored by social services, I had asked for meetings with the director, who at 16 was a very bold thing to do. But I knew that director had adopted children who were dual heritage. So sadly, he's now dead. And I remember Ken Boyce giving me time to speak and talk about my experiences. And when I got my letter at home, when I took that exam, and it said fail, I went to see him and he instructed an investigation. Interestingly, when the investigation outcome was shared, the college claimed not to have any copies of my coursework that was asked for. They had lost it. They managed to find my exam papers, and when that was reviewed, it was blatantly obvious that I'd been marked down. And what Ken Boyce wanted to do was to overturn the fail into a pass. But the board wouldn't allow him to do that. So I had to resit the exam, which I did, and obviously, because there was so much scrutiny, of course, because I was right, I passed. New beginnings, having to fight for justice. New beginnings, understanding my place in the world. New beginnings, being able to stand up, shake yourself down, continue to breathe, continue to move forward. New beginnings, when I was working at North Middlesex Hospital on the special care baby unit, we had a matron, and I remember taking some time off one day and coming back to work and saying to her, and she was asking, why I was off, she didn't like nurses who had time off, and I said to her, "Be repent. Dysmenorrhea went up with the ark," she said to me. Again, this is a woman who was quite intolerant of black nurses, nursery nurses on the wards. New beginnings, understanding racism, understanding adversity, understanding my role in overcoming adversity, understanding the fact that I had a voice, maneuvering those systems, navigating those barriers, that excluded and made me feel different. New beginnings, craving to go back to St. Lucia, where I felt secure, I felt safe, where I felt loved. And so in all I do now, and via Freedom to Fly, I want to show children that your beginning does not dictate your end. That if you make a mistake, that doesn't define you. That you will be knocked down, knowing that you always can stand up and rise. I want children to experience a richness of life that they can only have dreamt of. I want children to experience total safety. I want them to be children. I'm so tired of the disproportionality. I'm so tired of the adultification of our, particularly our young black men. And I will continue to work to address the issues of difference, the issues of oppression, the issues of discrimination, the issues of not feeling good enough, not being worthy. And it was never my intention to speak this long. I just really wanted to give you a synopsis of beginnings and how you can overcome adversity. Understanding that our initial responses are trauma-led, and understanding that for me, there has been a metamorphic transformation. There really has been a metamorphic transformation from my beginning to my now. And I'm so thankful. I'm so thankful to my mother for her legacy. I'm so thankful to my mother for the sacrifices that she made. And the values she's instilled in me, the work ethic she's instilled in me, the pride she's instilled in me, the boldness I learned because it was so different from her. She didn't instill that in me. She wasn't bold at all. Just feeling so secure in my sense of self now. Feeling and knowing that I'm worthy, that I'm enough, and all I need is within me. That I don't have to apologize for being uniquely me, authentically me. And that I have a lot to offer. I have a lot I can share. And I commit to sharing via Freedom to Fly. I commit to transforming, to empowering, to enabling, to ensuring that those marginalized individuals, those marginalized communities feel heard, feel held, feel supported. Thank you.